Dr. Ragosta's talk. My name is Bill Barker. I portray Mr. Jefferson here in Persona, and it's my honor to introduce John for his talk this evening. John is an award-winning author, and it's the stories of a lawyer and a beekeeper living here in Charlottesville. He is currently a historian at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. He is the author of Religious Freedom, Jefferson's Legacy, America's Creed, University of Virginia Press, 2013, and Wellspring of Liberty, How Virginia's Religious Dissenters Helped to Win the American Revolution and Secured Religious Liberty, Oxford University Press, 2010. He published Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution, Routledge, 2017, as a precursor to his most recent book, For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle, University of Virginia Press, 2023. He has taught history and law at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, and Hamilton, Oberlin, and Randolph colleges. Before returning to academia, Dr. Ragosta was a partner at Dewey Ballantine, the Washington offices of that law firm. Ragosta has got his PhD and JD from University of Virginia, and he also holds a Bachelor of Science in Physics, Chemistry, with a double major in philosophy. I'm surprised Bill didn't say it was the university. Thank you all very much for coming out. I'm very, very pleased and very humbled that you're all here tonight. Thank you especially to Caitlin Lawrence and to Leslie Bradley for helping to arrange things for tonight. But I'm very pleased you're here in part because I want to tell you a story that I think people need to hear about. It is a story that's a little bit surprising because it's a story of how the nation was in a crisis in 1798 and 1799 that almost destroyed the Union. And Patrick Henry had a critical role in that. But let me start by telling you the story that got me interested in this project. Because I read a letter and it was after I finished my PhD, and the letter surprised me. And I hope it surprises you as well, and so it launched this project. So the letter is written on January 15, 1799. It's a mild day, sunny day outside at Mount Vernon on the banks of the Potomac River. But when you read this letter, you get the sense that George Washington inside is becoming very stormy. You sense him pacing the wide pine boards, and he finally, in anger and frustration, he sits down at his desk, he picks up a sheaf of paper and a quill pen, man we know of as the sword of the American Revolution, decides to write a long letter to man we know of as the trumpet of the American Revolution, Patrick Henry. Now, they had not corresponded for years, but on this particular day, George Washington decides he must write Patrick Henry. He tells him there is a crisis when everything dear and valuable to us is assailed. Washington goes on to rail at people who are putting their own personal ambition and their own party politics above country and putting the nation at risk. Measures are systematically and pertinaciously pursued, which must eventually dissolve the Union or produce coercion. And by coercion, George Washington meant a U.S. Army marching on its own citizens. The nation was at risk. Possibility of civil war loomed. George Washington asked Patrick Henry to come out of retirement to help save the nation. Now, Henry was living in retirement as well at Red Hill, almost down on the North Carolina border. He, too, thought he could enjoy retirement under his own vine and fig tree, to use one of Washington's favorite biblical allusions. He had turned down positions as Secretary of State, as Supreme Court Justice, as Senator, as Ambassador to France, Ambassador to Spain. The last time he had communicated with Washington, he told him that he would not come out of retirement unless the nation faced the horrors of anarchy. When he receives Washington's letter in February of 1799, he writes back, "I accord with every sentiment you expressed to me. Patrick Henry agrees to come out of retirement to help save the nation. So who were the people putting their own ambition above country? Who was it that was putting the nation at risk of civil war? Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the radical states' rights agenda of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Now, this was a fascinating story. Patrick Henry comes out of retirement. He runs for office. He wins his election. Patrick Henry always wins his election. But he dies before he can take office. It is said that if Patrick Henry had lived, Thomas Jefferson almost certainly would have never been elected president. So that's the story I came across. And it fascinated me, and I thought, well, I need to find out more about what's going on with this story. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about three things. First of all, what happened? Why is Patrick Henry, the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement, coming out of retirement to oppose states' rights? Second, what about Jefferson? It's true that Jefferson would not have been elected president if Henry had lived. Does this tell us something about Thomas Jefferson? Is there something about Jefferson that we missed or not understood? And third, why was this not a bigger part of history? Why had I never heard of this before? Is it simply a failure of memory, or was something else at work here? So let's start in the summer of 1798 and the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, we know that since the Constitution was adopted and George Washington became president, the nation had been plagued with foreign policy issues since the French Revolution. In 1798, the immediate concern was France, of rising Napoleon Bonaparte. It was said that we had a quasi-war with France, that the French had requested a bribe from our peace negotiators, the XYZ affair, and this had resulted in a conflict between the United States and France. Now, it's called a quasi-war, but people were getting shot at. People were getting killed. France had seized over 330 U.S. ships. And the United States is afraid that we might be pulled into the European and Napoleonic Wars. The Federalists, the party of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, responds. They control the Congress, they control the presidency, and they respond in three ways. First, with the Alien Acts, making it far easier to expel aliens who might be a trouble to the United States. Second, they're going to increase the military budget because we might have a war with France, Napoleonic France. And third, and most ominously, they adopt the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act literally makes it illegal to criticize the President of the United States or the U.S. Congress. Oh, by the way, you can say anything you want about the Vice President. Vice President is Thomas Jefferson. You can go to jail criticizing the President or the Congress. Historians have told us for 150 years that there were 14 indictments under the Sedition Act, 10 convictions or fines. That grossly underestimated the impact. New research has shown that there were over 40 indictments, over 120 people were prosecuted, and they specifically targeted newspaper editors. They targeted the opposition press. They were throwing in jail those people supporting the Democratic-Republican Party. Jefferson said this was a reign of witches. He writes to James Madison that if the newspapers fail, republicanism will be entirely browbeaten. He writes another supporter, to preserve freedom of the press, every spirit should be ready to devote itself to martyrdom. This was a reign of witches. And it was a real crisis. It was a real danger to the nation to throw in jail people, the political opposition. So what do you do? What do you do if you're Jefferson and Madison? Well, if the first thing you would do is you have an election, you win the election, throw the bombs out, you repeal those laws, you pass different laws. Of course, that's the way the system's supposed to operate. But Jefferson's afraid maybe that won't work this time. First of all, we have a quasi-war with France. It won't be the first nor the last time where a foreign policy conflict had an effect on domestic policy, domestic politics. John Adams is personally popular for the first and only time in his life. He's actually taken to wearing a sword to public appearances. And then with the XYZ affair, Jefferson is concerned that maybe the election won't work. Add to that the Sedition Act, where you're throwing in jail our newspaper editors. Maybe the election won't work. So what do? What are your options? Well, the second option that Jefferson should have fallen on immediately is you sue the buggers. It's unconstitutional. It's a violation of the First Amendment. And you get the Sedition Act thrown out in court. And by the way, this is, of course, before Marbury versus Madison, but they were well aware of judicial review. Jefferson had spoken about it. Madison, Henry, Hamilton, they had all endorsed the idea of judicial review. If there's a problem, 5 of the 6 sitting Supreme Court justices had taken part in Sedition Act cases and not raised a whisper about its constitutionality. The First Amendment is still developing. The idea of freedom of the press is still developing. And if you sue them and you lose, and the Supreme Court seems to endorse the Sedition Act, you're worse off. So what do? They came upon a third option. They were going to turn to the states and seek the states' support against the federal government. Now, this had been done before. Patrick Henry, after all, had led the state opposition to Hamilton's financial plan. Henry, when he was in the Virginia legislature, had a remonstrance drafted, sent to the Congress, saying that this is wrong, it's unconstitutional, it must stop. But Jefferson wants to do more. A simple protest wasn't enough. So Jefferson resurrects the idea that the United States was a mere compact of independent states, a confederacy, and that a state could nullify, that's Jefferson's term, could nullify a federal law that they thought was unconstitutional. A state could interpose between the federal government and the people and stop federal law. This is what was stated in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. If this were true, we would have a different federal law in each state. We would have the federal government against the states having different laws, state against state. If the United States is a mere compact of independent states, succession is a real possibility. In 1799, Jefferson writes one supporter that determined were we to be disappointed in this repeal of the Sedition Act, to sever ourselves from that union that we so much value. Jefferson is actively discussing secession. There are reports that Virginia is arming. Virginia is buying muskets. People say it may be for a conflict with the federal government. One Virginia militia officer is quoted as saying, "If the French invade and land on our shores, I will take my troops to the tricolor rather than the stars and stripes carried by a political opponent." This is open treason, and it's being reported in the newspaper. This is the second crisis. We have the reign of witches, but Jefferson's response creates a second crisis. And this is what caused George Washington and Patrick Henry such concern. A threat of civil war. Newspapers carried the headline, "Civil War," in 1799. Great battle of American history is largely forgotten. And Patrick Henry's role is particularly poignant. Patrick Henry, after all, was the leading anti-federalist during the ratification debates. Patrick Henry had argued that the federal government was going to be too powerful, too distant from the people, and we shouldn't ratify the Constitution. In 1799, he comes out of retirement to defend the Constitution that he had opposed. He makes his final speech on March 4th, 1799 at Charlotte Courthouse. It's said in this speech, by the way, is very well reported, which is not always the case for Henry's speeches. It's said that he seemed sick, he seemed weak, he seemed old. He rose to speak and he had a gray cast about him. He was probably suffering from the consequence of the illness that would have killed him 3 months later. But as he began to speak, a wonderful transformation came over Henry. He rose up, his voice rang out as it had during the Revolution, and says, "What has happened has planted thorns upon my pillow." Henry has a way with words. He says that Virginia is to the Union as Charlotte County is to Virginia. Virginia has no more right to block the laws of the Union than Charlotte County has to block the laws of Virginia. Such opposition on the part of Virginia to the acts of the general government must beget their enforcement by military power, civil war, or in alliances. He warns the gathered thousands that Virginia is going to face a federal army led by George Washington. And who will dare to lift his hand against the father of his country, to point a weapon at the breast of the man who often led them to battle and to victory? It's an 18th century election. People would be drinking. Someone, and we know it's a gentleman named John Martin, so I was. And this was a mistake. Henry turns like and rises up. You dare not do it. In such a parricidal attempt, the steel would drop from your nerveless arm. This is classic Henry. If the administration has done wrong, let us all go wrong. Together, united we stand, divided we fall. Is the federal government too powerful? He says it is necessary to submit to the constitutional exercise of that power. You disagree with the federal government, Henry says, go to the ballot box. Go to the ballot box. You can never exchange the present government but for a monarchy. I think what Henry is saying very clearly to the group, he reminds them of his opposition to the Constitution, and he says, I warned you. I warned you that this was going to happen. I warned you the federal government was going to be too large. I warned you they were going to be too powerful. I warned you they would interfere with your rights. But we agreed. I didn't agree, but we, the people, agreed. And if we can't live within the Constitution that we adopted, then the only possibility is monarch. Henry defines for America in its youth what it meant to be loyal opposition to the government. He dies on June 6th of that year. John Randolph of Roanoke, who was a Jeffersonian at the time, is the one who says if Henry had lived, Jefferson would have never been elected president. So that's what Henry's doing. What about Jefferson? Is there something about Jefferson that maybe we've missed? Most histories, when speaking of Jefferson in the 1790s, have the 1798 Alien and Sedition Act followed by the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and then the Revolution of 1800, Jefferson wins. And it's all neat and clean, and one follows from the other. But in fact, that's a very misleading record of history. After the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, there's a midterm election. And the Democratic Republicans take a shellacking in those midterm elections. The Federalist Party in the Deep South, in South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina, had 4 representatives in Congress. After the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, they have 12. Because people thought that the Democratic Republicans were talking about secession and disunion. In Virginia, John Marshall, we remember him, Henry Lighthorse Lee are elected to Congress as Federalists with the assistance of Patrick Henry. Jefferson later complains he's astonished that these people could be elected. It is a taint in that part of the state which I had not expected. One wonders over the next 30 years as he's fighting with John Marshall, whether he remembers that it was Patrick Henry that got John Marshall elected to Congress and therefore appointed to the Supreme Court. But here's the thing about Jefferson. He and Madison realized after those midterm elections, and realized fairly quickly, they had made a mistake. They had gone too far. Of course, they can't say that. They're politicians. But Madison writes Jefferson 8 days after the Virginia resolutions are adopted. Now, Madison drafted the Virginia resolutions. These are his resolutions. He writes Jefferson within 8 days. It is to be feared their zeal, the Virginia legislature, which just adopted his resolution, their zeal may forget some considerations which ought to temper their proceedings. The charge of usurpation in the very act of protesting against the usurpations of Congress. Madison and Jefferson are backpedaling, and they're backpedaling fast. In 1798, the Democratic Republicans were openly challenging the federal government to indict somebody under the Sedition Act in the South. They were threatening to break them out of jail. They said, go ahead and indict somebody in the South and see what happens. In 1800, James Callender, we remember James Callender, he's the fellow who's going to talk about Sally Hemings 3 years later. James Callender is indicted under the Sedition Act, is put in jail in Richmond, and James Monroe, the new governor of Richmond, of Virginia, writes Jefferson and Madison and says, don't do anything stupid. Don't try to directly attack federal law. Let's let this play out. And suddenly the election becomes not about states' rights, but about a too powerful federal government interfering with freedom of the press. And so Jefferson and Madison shift. Nullification is tabled. They don't talk about that anymore. It's tabled until the fire eaters bring it back up in the 1820s. And then it explodes over Fort Sumter in 1861. President Jefferson, after he's elected in 1800, is chastened. It is said that since Jefferson became president, people have been saying he was a hypocrite because he wouldn't do as president the things he had been saying in the 1790s that he would do. I don't think Jefferson was so much a hypocrite as he was chastened. He realized some of the things he had been saying in the 1790s in the hyper-partisan atmosphere of the 1790s was crazy. He won at the ballot box. He didn't win by directly opposing federal policies. And if you reread Jefferson's first inaugural address with this in mind, it takes on an entirely different voice. The only thing anybody remembers from that inaugural address is we were all Federalists, we were all Republicans. But read the whole document. We unite in common efforts to the common good. He says, I realize why the Federalists were afraid of France invading. It's a remarkable statement for Jefferson to make. He's saying what unites us is more important than what divides us. Ironically, the fact that Jefferson won the presidency diffuses the crisis. Had Jefferson lost, he and Madison might have been back to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and that dispute between the federal government and the states. It's an enormous irony that the Revolution of 1800 resolves the possible Revolution of 1799. And then let's turn to the third thing. Because it's equally interesting to me is why is this story not better known? Why is Henry not better known? Perhaps Patrick Henry is more important than he's been given credit. After all, Henry, even Jefferson says that Henry gave the first impulse to the ball of the Revolution. It's not now easy to say what we should have done without Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry leads opposition to the Stamp Act when the opposition was a dead letter with his senator at his Brutus speech. The liberty or death speech, about the only thing anyone ever knows about Patrick Henry. 7 words he said in St. John's Church in 1775. That speech was about arming. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? And in a very tough vote, Henry wins to arm for a possible civil war. Henry becomes the first governor of the state of Virginia. He's critically important in getting supplies to Valley Forge. He helps defuse the Conway cabal that was seeking to replace George Washington as leader of the Continental Army. He's critical in sending George Rogers Clark out to the Northwest Territory. He's the leading anti-federalist in opposition to ratification of the Constitution, playing a critical role, therefore, in getting the Bill of Rights adopted. Because if the anti-federalists had not made a good case, we wouldn't have a Bill of Rights. He creates the critique of the Constitution and the intellectual basis of what becomes Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. And in 1799, he models what it means to be a loyal opposition. He's on everyone's short list in 1776 of leading founders. In 1786, party things true in 1796. But why is he not better known? Well, a part of it, he's responsible. Because, as I tell people, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, all of these people were really very, very concerned with what you and I are really thinking about them 200 years later. They preserve their papers. Some of the people in the papers here, they're very concerned about how their image will be reflected. Henry doesn't seem to care much. Some of the letters he has, he destroys. Second, in opposing the Constitution and refusing to take federal office, he could have been Supreme Court, he could have been Secretary of State. He's sort of on the wrong side of history. But I think there's something else. He's directly and viciously attacked by political opponents for years after his death. He is all tongue without either head or heart. What we have to do, I think, is devoutly pray for his death. He's avaricious and rotten-hearted. He read nothing. He had no books. He wrote almost nothing. He could not write. In his heart, he preferred low society. His legal reasoning is not worth a copper. George Wythe absolutely refused to sign his law license. He had contempt and hatred for George Washington. All of these come from the pen of Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson continues to attack Henry for years after his death. He told Daniel Webster 26 years later and William Wirt all of these things. Now, we know some of these things are ridiculous. The idea that he had contempt and hatred for George Washington, the story I began with, if nothing else, would demonstrate that's not true. We know that George Wythe does, in fact, sign his law license. We know that he has an excellent library. It's not like Jefferson's library, but he has an excellent library by 18th century standard. But other Jeffersonians took up Jefferson's attacks on Henry. It was said that he was senile, he was jealous, he was a religious fanatic. The Aurora, the leading Democratic Republican newspaper in early 1799, had praised Henry, Venerable Patrick Henry. His reputation is a light pure, and his talents conspicuous. After his March speech, they write, he's in the insuspicious temper of second childhood. It has made him a duke. He drag his aged limbs and break his wind. He farted. They're telling fart jokes about Patrick Henry. This is picked up for years by Jeffersonians. Edward Pollard, you may remember Edward Pollard, the author of The Lost Cause and the Unrepentant Confederate, attacks Patrick Henry in the 1870s, says he wasn't even a very good speaker because he had opposed Jefferson's states' rights in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So why is Jefferson doing this? And we know why Pollard still hit. He was a kind of Confederate. It relates to the 1781 investigation of Jefferson's governorship. Those in Charlottesville will recall the Redcoats have invaded Virginia, and Sir Tarleton, bloody man, is bringing Redcoats to Charlottesville, trying to capture Jefferson and the Virginia legislature. Jefferson tails it that way off in the Mount Alto to escape, and he doesn't go with the legislature to Stanton. And the governor, now technically his term was up, but they had not appointed a new governor. And so the state was left without an executive. And when the legislature gets to Stanton, they launch an investigation of Jefferson's governorship, essentially accusing him of incompetence, cowardice, and dishonor. We don't accuse an 18th century general of dishonor without them remembering. History is not very clear as to whether Henry was behind this investigation. I think he probably was. But history is not very clear about that question, but it doesn't really matter. Jefferson believed that Henry was responsible for this investigation. He writes James Monroe that it inflicted a wound on my spirit which will only be cured by the all-healing grave. And leaving from Jefferson is such a lot. We can easily forget that the founders were not marble statues. They were persons, and they had their personal battles. I tell people, Jefferson disliked Hamilton. He hates Patrick Henry. Hamilton, that's a political distinction. Henry, this is personal. He's accused me of dishonor. Well, that's enough. History professors will ask you when you do a project, so what? So what? It's an interesting story, but so what? Well, I think there's several so whats to this story. First, the centrality of newspapers and the free press. Jefferson was correct. It's a reign of witches if the government is going to attack the free press of the political opposition. Anyone who tells you that the press is an enemy of the American people is themselves an enemy of the Union. Second, state rights can go too far. It didn't work in the 1780s, and Patrick Henry, the great anti-federalist, says it can go too far. It can put the Union at risk. Third, Henry was right about the broader question about what it means to be a loyal opposition. We often point to the Revolution of 1800, the peaceful transfer of government from one party to another. It almost didn't happen. Henry is clear. We disagree with government policy to go the battle box. And of course, the impact on remembered history. History is not just lived, it is written. Henry dies, and Jefferson, by the way, says this: you don't want to die first and have your political opponents out of view. Jefferson outlives Henry by 27 years. But Jefferson leaves a very poor memory of Henry. Today, the increasingly radical opponents of government had embraced Henry as an icon, give me liberty or give me death, as if that's the only thing that Patrick Henry ever said. It's a terrible misinterpretation of Henry, who in fact was committed not only to personal liberty, but also to community. I think Henry deserves better. In any case, I hope you enjoy the book, and I have some time. I would be happy to answer questions. And I see that Dr. Pickham has one in his head.
I'm assuming the applause were for you. First, that was fabulous talk. And you forced me to rethink Henry, and I acknowledge you for that. I have one tiny question. In your So What Hendy, you talk about the Braham witches and the importance of the government not going after the press. How then do you explain President Jefferson urging his political allies in Pennsylvania and New York to prosecute every newspaper editor who criticizes him? And when he doesn't have a Jeffersonian governor in Connecticut to do his dirty work, he not only appoints a new federal district judge, which he's entitled to, if the old one just died, but then has his U.S. attorney prosecute what is today, I believe, the oldest newspaper in the country, or one of them, the Connecticut Courant, the Hartford Courant, prosecute the Hartford Courant and its editors, as well as a minister and a couple of other people. How do you explain the shift from First Amendment Tom to which is John and which is John Abbott?
Look, Jefferson is not 100% consistent throughout his life. I mean, that a long discussion on that, as we well know. Most of those prosecutions, what he says, and then he does back off a little bit. Most of the prosecutions are by the state sedition acts, but he always thought that was different. They're not bound by the First Amendment. That still doesn't explain why they do allow them to attack your political opponents, but you don't have a First Amendment problem. The Connecticut prosecution he does, which is, I think, the most serious because it's a federal prosecution, he does eventually back off, as you know. So, no, he's not entirely consistent. He has a thin skin.
Actually, it doesn't back off because that doesn't reach the Supreme Court until Madison is president. Madison backs.
Yes, Madison and Jefferson decide maybe this isn't such a good idea. But no, he's not entirely consistent about this. He has a thin skin about opposition. But he's correct about the fundamental point that this is bad news.
We can talk a little bit about what changed in the world this year. Also, I spring meeting I'm still not in the 18 yet.
I think they wanted to, because this is being recorded. I'm sorry, we should wait for a microphone.
I should have. I was going to ask if you could just talk a little bit about James Monroe and become governor during all this, and where did you all take? How was his support, Jefferson?
Well, the name of the question, James Monroe's role, mostly it's the incident I talk about with the calendar opposition when he's become governor. And he realizes, again, the letter he writes to Jefferson and to Madison are phenomenal. because he knows what they had been talking about. He knows there was a law. Again, getting into the details, some of this is in the book. Virginia actually introduced a law in 1799, I believe, which would have given state judges the right to issue habeas corpus against federal prisoners. Okay, now you can imagine how that would work. So, and the idea was, fine, you indict somebody under the Sedition Act, you throw them in jail, and we'll have a state judge take them out of jail. And we would have been a direct conflict to the federal marshals against the state marshals. And so that's what they were talking about. So when Monroe says, don't do anything stupid, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, that's not the way Monroe said it, but he's realizing that and I think he's also a little more optimistic because he's won election in Virginia, and he's thinking, look, let's let the electoral process play out here. But he's, I wouldn't say he's a major player in this.
You said that, you said that in 1798, the Democratic Republicans lost very bad because the people thought they had gone too far. So how do you explain that only 2 years later, although Jefferson was still fierce in late 98 and 99, why did they went and voted for him very much in December 1800?
It's a very good question. I mean, in several thoughts. First of all, keep in mind the 1800 election was not exactly a landslide. A small change of votes, Adams won. And of course, Jefferson wins because of the 3/5 clause, the additional votes in the South because of the enslaved. But if you look at that campaign, and it's a vicious campaign, the campaign of 1800 is a vicious campaign, but the idea of state rights and nullification is just disappearing. The Jeffersonians are now talking about the federal government's too big, it's too powerful, they're interfering with freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And so the message has changed. And I think this is where Monroe is coming from. We've got a good message here. Stop with this succession talk, which, of course, Jefferson never says that publicly. That letter I'm quoting is a private letter. But stop with that talk and talk about what's really going on here. The federal government's too large. So Jefferson campaigns on cutting the federal government, cutting the budget deficit, protecting rights, putting power back into the states is the only thing he's saying about the states, but not that the states would directly oppose the government. So, he was able to win. They perhaps overestimated. I started by saying, Jefferson didn't think the electoral process would work. He was wrong about that. And we have to be very careful about any politician who says the electoral process won't work. Because that's all we had. That's all we got.
Wow. Hi, John. I feel curious about why you are so persuaded by John Randolph's opinion about Patrick Henry's influence. It seems like you just give us some very good reasons that even one great man, Congress, wouldn't necessarily sway the nation to that extent. I'm not sold. Why are you?
Jen specifically asking, would Jefferson have won anyway, even if Henry had lived? There are a couple of things, and actually I made them stop the presses. I literally had to prove the proofs, and I came across a letter that you may be familiar with. It's a letter people are familiar with, but nobody reads the last paragraph. It's a letter from Benjamin Rush to Jefferson right after the inaugural address. At the bottom of that, Rush says, you remember this, Jefferson, that when we spoke 2 years ago, and you said that if Henry was dead and Washington was dead, your electoral success would be far more certain and far quicker. And lo and behold, Jefferson and Madison are dead. If I want to make a lot of money, by the way, I'm to write historical fiction, and Monroe killed them. But what Randolph is actually referring to is, and again, I didn't realize I was writing about contemporary events. They're playing with the Electoral College. People don't know what the Electoral College is or how it works. The states are just beginning to adopt a winner-take-all approach. In Virginia, the proposal to adopt a winner-take-all to basically help Jefferson, everybody understood what it was about. This will help get Jefferson elected, passes the Virginia House of Delegates by 5 votes. If you go on in that quote by Randolph, he says, compare. He said Patrick Henry was good for 5 times 5 votes in the Virginia legislature any day of the week. And so he says he would have blocked the winner take all. Add that to maybe losing a few votes in Virginia, maybe a few in North Carolina, maybe a few in Kentucky. We don't know. I mean, what ifs? We don't know. We can't prove it. I think Jefferson would have had a very difficult time if Henry had lived, or if Washington had lived. Because I think Washington, who was trying not to come out publicly, is George Washington. I think he was so upset, I think Washington would have come out and said something publicly about, I support John Adams. It would have been an extraordinary statement in itself. If Henry had come out publicly and said, I think John Adams should be given another term. Well, we all know for sure that.
Thank you. You had said that the First Amendment was still being defined in 1799. What do you think was the definitive two acts that put the First Amendment on track as we know it today, or at least as we knew it 15 years?
Boy, no, I don't know. I mean, this is a very good question. I can tell you what the shift is to give some support here. The old British system was basically no prior restraint. That free speech and freedom of the press meant you can't block publication, but you could throw somebody in jail later for sedition. That was the British system. And so there was some question as to whether that was going to be in a system in the United States, which is why, as I said, 5 or 6 Supreme Court justices had sat on Sedition Act cases and didn't seem to be bothered by it. As to when exactly we adopt, it's certainly long before New York Times versus Sullivan, but I don't really know as soon as that shift occurs. I think it's relatively soon. They have a more expansive view of free speech than the British, but I can't really say when. But yeah, come around. Okay, when this one across the room.
Thank you, John. I took your opening comments were intended to give us hope that
Good.
well, perhaps you can start ongoing. That the country had come to an edge and it's able to right itself and continue. Here we are. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, these were men and hopefully some women who were the generation that fought the war that enabled the country. And so their sensibilities, their frame of reference was a bit different than now. And so I'm wondering, well, who's our Patrick Henry? Who are? And I'm wondering if the political structure that allowed for calmer minds to prevail, wisdom to prevail, is that, and I'm not a historian, not a commentator, but nevertheless, I can't resist. If it, do we have the environment to hope that the wisdom of our elders or whatever, they all seem to be deciding not to run again, will prevail? Where's is your if your intention was to give hope, which maybe I read too much in your comments, where is the message in hope, or where we find the hopeful?
I don't know. It is a very good question. It's a fair question. I think there are several things happening here. First, I am always careful about people who compare the election of 1800 to, say, the election of 2020. The election of 1800 was bishops. Jefferson's an atheist. He's going to prostitute your daughters, burn the Bibles. Adams is a monarchist who trying. I think those comparisons are very difficult for some of the reasons implicit in what you're saying. They didn't have social media. They didn't have a lot of other things that we had. They didn't have gerrymandering, although Haley actually starts gerrymandering. It should have been called henrymandering, but probably just as well for his reputation that it wasn't. But they're just developing some of those things. So there are great differences, as you used to know. But it was the 1790s were a period of hyper-partisanship. The nation was on the verge of civil war, I think, or at least they thought it might be. There were politicians who were willing to rethink that and pull back. There was a recognition that the only way to address problems is at the ballot box. So all of these things are relevant to us today. Are they enough? Hope so. I was going to give my public service announcement. Well, I have 3 public service announcements. When the polls are open until 7 o'clock, you all have to leave here if you haven't voted and go to the polls.
Thanks, John. That was a great talk. Try something out here, which is, I think, another maybe reason that Henry doesn't get remembered for this incident is partly because I think there's like a attempt to downplay the severity of the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, and that is Madison in 1832, 2832, basically saying there's something very different between what we were saying in 98 versus what the South Carolina ordinance of nullification says. I'm just wondering what you make of that, and I mean, my sense was that you actually think this was that Madison is wrong in 1828 about the severity of what he did in 98. I just hope you could elaborate on that. Well, thanks.
Yeah, don't tell them Madison lies. Don't say Madison's 50. This is a very good question. But the way Madison pulls back, he knows they went too far. And so his description in the 1820s and 1830s of what they had done in 1798 is revisionist, shall we say. I shouldn't say but it is very revisionist. But as is often the case, Madison is toning Jefferson down. That happens a lot. But, for example, there's talk after the fact. Go back to your more fundamental point. After this crisis, nobody wants to admit, we almost drove the train off the track. Nobody wants to admit we almost took the train, over the cliff. Certainly Jefferson does not want to admit that he was talking about secession. And in fact, he says later, we never talked about violence. He writes the letter, the famous letter. There was never any talk about violence. The governor of Pennsylvania sent you a letter saying, I have 20,000 troops ready to march on Washington, D.C. But he says, no, there was never any talk about violence. There was never any talk about secession, but thankfully we have his letters. And there was, so yes, they downplay it. I think Madison, wishful thinking and revisionist, and maybe memory not being quite what it was. But if you look at what was being said, and in fairness to Madison, the Virginia resolutions we haven't gotten into the distinction between Virginia and Kentucky. The Virginia resolutions are much milder than the Kentucky resolutions. The Virginia resolutions, for example, are a little opaque on whether this can be done by a single state or by the states, which that's worlds apart. But what's curious to me about that is when he writes that letter, 8 days later, saying we've gone too far, we may be accused of usurpation, he's talking about the weaker Virginia resolutions. So what does Madison think about the Kentucky resolutions? In fact, well, I shouldn't give the young too far. It's an interesting piece of this is when the Virginia resolutions are introduced. I mean, this is a great Jefferson-Madison conflict. So Jefferson writes the Kentucky resolutions that call for nullification. Madison writes the much weaker Virginia resolutions. Jefferson gets shown a draft of Madison's resolutions, and he says they're not strong enough. He doesn't tell Madison that. He says they're not strong enough. He gets one of his cronies in the Virginia legislature to introduce the language to Madison's resolutions that the federal law is null, void, of no force and effect. Madison, who's also not in the legislature, gets one of his cronies in the legislature to pull that out. So we're having a battle between Jefferson and Madison about how far should we go through proxies in the Virginia legislature. So I think Madison knew that Jefferson had gone way too far. He was afraid that he had gone too far. And I think he's, they can't admit it. They can't say publicly, we were artists and we almost destroyed the country. Imagine that, a politician that may go and that it's still thinking of, I don't know what time it is. I guess we have a few more questions. Otherwise, we can let people, there's line and G's and so on. But otherwise, hope
Have a last question.
short. That nut.
Thank you. I think Patrick Henry in 1787 or 1788 thought about creating a new republic in Kentucky in the West because he was so dissatisfied by the Constitution. So if that is correct, how come he changed so much within a few years and saying the Union, there should be only one republic and the Union is sacred?
Very good question. I don't think Henry ever went as far as the idea of Franklin, the idea of an independent state or independent nation. He does talk about escaping to the frontier in hope, and it's like whether he's talking about an independent nation or just nobody will bother me. He talks about moving to Georgia. But he had said from day one, I talk about this at some length in the book, at the Virginia ratification debates, he ain't opposing the Constitution. He's fighting, and he brings up slavery near the end and says they're going to take your slaves. He has some terrible attack on that. The final day, he seems to realize he's going to lose. And he gives a speech. And he says, if I've lost in a good cause. I've done my best job. I will continue to seek change, but I will seek it, and I'm paraphrasing, but the quote is, in a constitutional way. Which was going to be the title of the book till my editor said, don't use it. But he says specifically, I oppose this, but I will seek change in a constitutional way. The evening after the vote, George Mason, who was the other leading anti-federalist, calls a meeting of anti-federalists in Richmond to discuss what are we going to do. The Constitution was just ratified by Virginia. How are we going to oppose it? And we will continue to fight. We'll continue. And again, the records of this meeting are not very clear. This was a secret meeting, after all. And I explain in the book why my conclusion is, and there's different reports. The one report is Henry goes to that meeting. He's called. He's not there. They call Henry in. Henry listens to what Mason is saying, which is basically talking about a fifth column to continue to attack the Constitution before it's even dry, and which would have been disastrous. And Henry basically says, we can't do this. We lost. Go home. The language he uses is give it fair play, and let's see what happens. So that incident had a strong influence on my views of what he was doing in 1799, because he does seem to understand the idea. Look, there was a UVA blog I did about this. First rule in a democracy, majority rules. Second rule in a democracy, a minority has to accept the first rule. You know, you lose sometime. And if you're going to have a country, when you lose, you got to accept it. And you go to the ballot box. And Henry does seem to talk about that both in 1799 and in 1788. So I'm not aware of him ever talking about, we'll have an independent country. He does talk about, I want to flee to the frontier because I think you people are all crazy. But with that, thank you all very much. I'll do have several. And three out is George Hitchin and volunteer.